Today we're going to review the parts of a firearm that we started to talk about before, and we're going to talk about the different types of firearms so that once we get into actually investigating a crime scene, we have some background knowledge to go off of. So to look at the parts of a firearm, we're going to look at this handgun first. So this is a semi-automatic, a fairly modern semi-automatic pistol, and so it will give us a good example of our parts. So first off, we have the barrel. So this cylinder here is the tube that the bullet will fly down when the gun's fired. And this helps keep the gun accurate, guide the bullet to where the shooter wants it to go. So the barrel. And then on this particular gun, this entire piece on the top that moves is the action. And so we can't see it from the inside. It's well covered, but the action is the important part of the gun that actually causes the action. Without the action, the gun wouldn't fire. It would just be a block of metal. So the parts of the action that we've talked about are the chamber, which holds the cartridge that's fired. And then inside the chamber, we have this little hole here is the firing pin. That's where the firing pin will come out of. So there's actually a little pin that'll come out. And then we also have the hammer, which is pulled back when it's released. The gun fires. And then we have the trigger, which is pulled to release the hammer. In this case, the gun's not loaded, and so the hammer is not releasing when the trigger's pulled. But I pull back the action, releases the trigger. So, before we go into the other parts, let's just review how a gun actually works. So, when a gun is fired, it fires a bullet. So, this entire thing is not a bullet. This is a cartridge. So, this is what's loaded into a gun and what's fired out of it. This copper-colored part at the end, that is the bullet itself. And so, only that segment, like a quarter of this, is the actual bullet. The rest is gunpowder and a layer to separate the bullet from the gunpowder. So all of this is enclosed in what's called the casing, this piece of brass surrounding the bullet. Now the way that this fires, because right now this is as dangerous as any other cartridge, it's just not in a gun. So the way that this fires is that inside the gun, the firing pin will come forward and strike this silver circle. So this is called the primer. When the firing pin hits it, or when anything hits it, it will create a spark that will ignite the gunpowder, cause an explosion, and send the bullet flying out the end. So when the firing pin comes forward, it'll strike the primer, and that will ignite the gunpowder, which will fire the bullet. So this cartridge is for this gun. So it fits right in here. So it's about the same size as the chamber, because the chamber is meant to hold it when it's fired. So the last couple parts of the gun that we haven't talked about yet. So we have the trigger. Well, we got the trigger. And then the grip, which is where it's gripped. And so remember, handguns are distinguished from firearms. The fact that they're made to be held with one hand, or designed to be able to be held with one hand. So I can fire this with one hand or use two hands for support, but it can be fired with one hand, therefore it's a handgun. So we have the grip, and then we have the sights on top. And so the way that this gun is aimed, there's a white circle on that little dot in the front, and then two white circles on the back. So one in the front, two in the back. To fire, you line them up. To aim, you line them up, I should say. So those are the parts of a handgun. So to look at the different types of handguns, this is a fairly modern one. We're going to look at an older style that we started with. And so if you've ever seen a Western, you've probably seen a revolver. And so this is a fairly modern revolver, and a very large one at that. So a revolver is called a revolver because in it, there's this cylinder that revolves. So the cylinder commonly holds 6 cartridges, thus the name 6-shooter if you've heard that before, but they can hold more. I have another one that I'll show you in the next video that holds 8. So the way the revolver works, you will load the cartridges into the cylinder, and so like so. This one doesn't fit because it's not the right size for this gun. But you'll load them in and then put the cylinder into the center of the gun. So the cylinder is part of the action. And then to fire it, you'll pull back the hammer, which will spin the cylinder, rotate the cylinder, and then when you pull the trigger, the hammer will go forward and strike right here. And so this is the back of the firing pin. When the hammer strikes the firing pin, it goes forward and then strikes the primer, igniting the gunpowder and firing the bullet. So if I pull the trigger, the hammer goes forward. So notice this gun reloads on its own. So when you pull the hammer back, the cylinder rotates and automatically loads the next cartridge in place. And then pull the trigger again, it fires. So that's how a single action revolver works. So a revolver is a type of action, and then a subtype within that is a single action revolver. So this is actually a double action revolver. This revolver, which is much older, is a single action. And so in order to fire this, you have to pull the hammer back. Watch, you see that the cylinder still rotates on this when you pull the hammer back. And then you pull the trigger to fire. If I pull the trigger without pulling the hammer, nothing happens. I have to pull the hammer back in order for the gun to fire. So this revolver is a double action revolver. And so I have two options for firing this. One, I can pull the hammer back just like a single action fire, or if I need to fire it more quickly, I can just pull the trigger back and the hammer will cock back and come back forward on its own. So the entire action will do its job with just the pull of a trigger. Now, it's much more difficult to pull the trigger than it is to cock the hammer back and then pull the trigger. So if I cock the hammer back, it pulls the trigger back most of the way, so it's easier to pull. So watch the trigger. It's easier to pull because I cocked it back than if I just pull the trigger. So that's a double action revolver. So the more modern type of action is a semi-automatic. So that's the first gun we saw. In a semi-automatic, all you have to do to fire the gun is pull the trigger just like with a double action revolver. But instead of having a revolving cylinder holding the cartridges, you have what's called a magazine or a clip. So the magazine can hold several cartridges. In this case, it can hold 10, as indicated down here. So the magazine, you'll load it with cartridges, and then it will just fit into the grip of the gun. So it's normally empty. Magazine goes in, locks in place. So when I cock the gun back, it would load a cartridge and then release it to go forward again. And then I just pull the trigger to fire. So it won't do anything because there aren't any cartridges in it. So a magazine with a cartridge will just look like this. So this cartridge is full of magazines, but this doesn't fit this gun. You can see it's a lot smaller. So one last part of a firearm that I forgot to mention is the safety. So arguably the most important part of a firearm because it prevents the trigger from moving backwards. So here I can pull the trigger back no problem. If I take the safety off, then the trigger will actually cause the action of the gun to go forward. And so in this case, the safety, you can still pull the trigger, but it kind of separates it from the rest of the action. Take the safety off, red because safety's off, it actually fires. So our three types of handguns, to review, are a single action revolver. You have to pull the hammer back, pull the trigger. And then we have a double action revolver. You can pull the hammer back or you can just pull the trigger. And then a semi-automatic in which instead of the revolving cylinder, you have a clip. But once again, you still pull the trigger. And every time you pull a trigger, it will fire. And so an automatic weapon, you can just hold the trigger down and it will continue to fire. That's not the case here. You have to pull it for each firing.